The Oval Office, Washington, D.C., March 19, 2026. Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae traveled across the globe to Washington to discuss the precarious future of the Strait of Hormuz and the intensifying war in Iran. She had likely prepared meticulously, armed with complex economic dossiers and strategic military briefings. Everything seemed to be proceeding with diplomatic decorum until the atmosphere shifted abruptly.
Surprise. Who knows better about surprise than Japan? Okay? Why didn't you tell me about Pearl Harbor? Okay?
Prime Minister Takaichi could hardly have anticipated facing a stinging question that reached deep into the painful past from President Donald Trump. Why didn't you tell me about Pearl Harbor? This remark by President Trump was not merely a piece of brash, off-the-cuff banter. It perfectly encapsulates the diplomatic style of the art of the deal that has become his global trademark. In the American president's worldview, diplomacy is a calculated fusion of shock and uncertainty. When questioned by the Japanese delegation regarding why the US failed to notify its allies before launching coordinated airstrikes with Israel against Iran, Trump invoked the tragic history of his adversary-turned-ally to justify his own strategy of the element of surprise. By referencing the 1941 attack, he effectively silenced the room, using a historical trauma to pivot the conversation toward his current military doctrine. However, his comparison of the ongoing strikes in Iran to the events of Pearl Harbor in 1941 remains deeply puzzling and controversial, especially with Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae sitting directly beside him as a staunch Asian ally. Analysts suggest that for Trump, the result is everything, while protocol and prior notification are merely secondary inconveniences. By pushing Takaichi into an incredibly awkward position, causing the smile to vanish instantly from the Japanese Prime Minister's face, Trump established a position of absolute dominance in the talks. This is his method of forcing allies to accept a stark reality: the United States will act according to its own national interests, and if allies want a seat at the table, they must contribute significantly more. While he spared a moment to praise Japan for putting in the effort, unlike NATO, he was careful to remind them of the steep price for the protection of tens of thousands of US troops stationed across the land of the rising sun. To understand why Trump invoked this name as a symbol of surprise, we must look back at the historical catalysts that led Japan to launch an attack without a formal declaration of war, reaching Washington on December 7, 1941. In reality, Japan's intent was not cowardly in a vacuum. At that time, Japan was being strangled by a US-led economic noose, specifically an oil embargo that targeted the very lifeblood of the Japanese military. Facing the total depletion of resources within months, the Japanese military leadership, headed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, believed that diplomatic negotiations would never bear fruit unless the US conceded control over the Pacific. The primary reasons the attack was unannounced include absolute military surprise. Japan knew that American industrial might was many times greater than its own. Their only chance for victory, or at least to force the US to the negotiating table, was to annihilate the US Pacific Fleet at port before it could react. If notified even a few hours in advance, American preparation would have turned the mission into a disaster for the Japanese air service. Additionally, there was a fatal bureaucratic delay. A 14-part diplomatic message severing ties was supposed to be delivered to Secretary of State Cordell Hull just moments before the first bombs fell. However, delays in decoding and typing at the Japanese embassy in Washington meant the message was only delivered once the smoke and fire had already engulfed Pearl Harbor. The consequence was over 2,400 American lives lost, and Japan inadvertently awakened a sleeping giant, leading to the even more horrific tragedies of 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Returning to 2026, Trump's question, "Who understands surprise better than Japan?" serves as a chilling reminder that in the world of great powers, trust always takes a backseat to military strength. Trump is using the ghosts of the past to signal that the US is currently conducting similar preemptive strikes against Iran to prevent a nuclear menace, regardless of whether allies are briefed beforehand. Prime Minister Takaichi, despite being visibly shocked by Trump's bluntness, ultimately had to pledge that Japan would intensify its efforts in the Strait of Hormuz. This was a classic Trumpian diplomatic victory, using brashness to shatter ceremonial barriers, using history to lock the opponent's mouth, and finally securing concrete budgetary and military commitments. Critics may call it a lack of tact, but for Trump, it is the art of ensuring that the United States does not bear the financial and human costs of war alone. Or, even before departing for Washington, the Japanese Prime Minister admitted that her first official trip to the US as head of government would be an uphill battle. Although Takaichi is relatively new to power, she has rapidly built a personal relationship with Trump that appears both close and trusting. However, just recently, President Trump requested that Japan deploy warships to the Strait of Hormuz to secure commercial shipping, a request Takaichi initially failed to meet, leaving Trump visibly disgruntled. The US is currently in an armed conflict with Iran, yet Japan still relies on imports of Iranian oil and gas, creating a massive strategic friction point. As the war between the US and Iran drags on, Washington's demand for tangible support from traditional strategic allies like Japan only intensifies. Trump has publicly declared that the US is keeping a ledger and will eventually settle accounts with allies and partners who have relied on American money and security guarantees for decades, but ignore the US exactly when the US needs them. Rebuffed by European allies, Trump is likely to use this summit to pressure Japan into deploying minesweepers and naval forces to assist in reopening the Strait of Hormuz as the Middle East conflict enters its third high-intensity week. He has also ramped up the pressure by asserting that Tokyo owes Washington after years of receiving defense support, while highlighting Japan's extreme vulnerability to Middle Eastern oil disruptions. This demand places Takaichi, a staunchly conservative politician and Japan's first female prime minister, in a nearly impossible bind. She is not only restricted by Japan's pacifist constitution, but also by public opinion. Only 9% of the Japanese population supports the American and Israeli strikes against Iran. Following Trump's shocking statements regarding Pearl Harbor, Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae is trapped in a true quagmire. How to appease an increasingly impatient White House occupant without violating the legal and historical red lines of her own nation. The reality of Takaichi's dilemma lies in Japan's near-total energy dependence on the Middle East, with approximately 95% of its crude oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. However, the pacifist constitution, particularly Article 9, serves as a golden hoop, or a legal shackle, preventing Tokyo from engaging deeply in overseas military conflicts. Although the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe previously loosened regulations regarding collective self-defense, deploying warships for a direct offensive operation against Iran remains legally impossible unless it can be proven that Japan's very survival is under direct existential threat. Therefore, observers suggest that to neutralize Trump's wrath and resentment, Takaichi will likely choose a strategy of economic compensation for military restraint. Instead of getting bogged down in legal debates over troop deployments that have no clear answer, Tokyo may proactively offer massive concessions in areas that Trump values most, a colossal investment project worth up to $500 billion into the American domestic market, coupled with commitments to purchase more US goods and tighten cooperation in rare earth metals. Strategic cards in the competition with China is the most effective medicine to soothe the US president. Using financial power to trade for security understanding is a highly calculated move. It allows Japan to maintain a relatively neutral stance with Iran, a nation with which Tokyo has long sought to preserve friendly ties, while ensuring that the American military umbrella in East Asia remains firm against growing pressure from Beijing. For experts, this is a delicate mission, showing support for the US without being sucked into the vortex of an endless war. However, these concessions face significant skepticism within Japan. Many critics fear that once patrol vessels are deployed, regardless of the stated mission, Japan will be seen as having chosen a side, thereby diminishing its long-standing international standing. But in a world where Trump views contribution as the sole metric of an alliance, Takaichi may have few other options. Using economic gain to navigate political difficulty is not just a concession, it is a pragmatic survival strategy for Japan in a world where old rules are being dismantled by Washington's impulsive diplomatic style. To conclude, Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae also observed that it is not just the Middle East, but the entire security environment of the Indo-Pacific that is becoming increasingly complex. In this context, the firm commitments to the Japan-US alliance from President Donald Trump are a critical factor that must be deeply respected and prioritized.